All right, wanted to turn on recording. What we're going to talk about today is lease purchase and rent to own. There is a big difference between lease purchase and rent to own, and you're going to have tenants that are going to call you, and most of them are going to probably come off of AOD. You get a lot of rental calls on AOD, and they're going to say, I'm looking for a lease purchase property. Why are you looking for lease purchase? Well, my credit's bad right now and I want to buy a house. So I thought I would buy a lease purchase so I don't have to move again. I've been doing this for 17 years and I've closed one lease purchase. And I have done innumerable contracts for lease purchase. People who do lease purchase have either one, credit so bad that they can't get into an apartment complex. So they think if they tell the seller that they're going to buy the house in a year or two, that their credit is repairable, that they'll let them in to rent the house. Or two, they want more house than they can afford. They think if they tell the seller, oh, I'm going to buy the house in a year, instead of $1,200 a month rent, let's do $1,000 so I can save my money for the down payment. Most sellers don't fall for it. I promise. Most sellers don't fall for it. Lease purchase people, once they get comfortable, tend to stop doing what they need to do to fix their credit, if they even know what that is in the first place. Ryan got a call 2 weeks ago from a woman on AOD. She wants to lease purchase a townhome with a rent of at least $3,500 a month. She's got bad credit. She can't buy right now, but she can pay $3,500 a month on a lease. In a lot of cases, these people think that the entire amount they pay for rent is going to be credited towards purchase. Well, it's not. If you want money credited toward the purchase of the property, you have to pay over the rental amount. So if the rent's $3,500 a month and you want to escrow some money for your down payment, you can give the seller $4,000 as long as it's written out correctly in the contract that money is for the down payment of the purchase of the house. And if for some reason the purchase does not consummate, that they get that money back. But most of the time they don't have the extra money to do it. And again, that is not their intention. The lease purchase contract, I was reviewing the new contracts this morning. I hadn't gone over them in a while because I haven't written one of these contracts in a while. The lease purchase contract used to require and used to make the tenant responsible for all repairs. So if they moved into a property with the intent of purchasing it in 12 or 24 months, while they were living there during that time frame, if the toilet clogged or if the sink backed up or if there was a leak, they were responsible for fixing it. Well, that's a really bad thing because most of the time these people don't have the money. They don't have the money to buy a house. They don't have the money to fix it. They let these repairs go on and on without telling anyone about them and without getting them fixed. And at the end of 12 months or 24 months, when they can't purchase the home and the landlord gets possession back, if he doesn't have to evict them, he goes into a disaster. You know, the floor is falling in the kitchen, or there was a leak in the roof and the ceilings come down in the master, things of that nature, because technically they are the owners of the house during this time period. I used to recommend rent to own because, again, that the landlord was responsible for the repairs. They would do something called an option payment. Typically, an option payment would be something similar to the security deposit that they would pay up front. It was non-refundable if they didn't buy the house, but would go toward their purchase in the form of earnest money if they did. Again, the lease purchase and rent to own are one thing now as far as the GAR forms go. So we're going to do a screen share here quick. And in the GAR purchase and sale agreement on the exhibits and addenda, can everybody see this? Okay. You've got here lease for lease purchase, and lease purchase and sale exhibit. One is F207, has to be used with F916. The other one is F916 to be used with F207. Okay, so both of these are required. If somebody wants to do a lease purchase, you can type up upfront a purchase and sale agreement agreeing on a price with the seller. Typically, it's going to be an over market price because they're not going to sell it for a year or two. Seller's going to assume the property is going to increase in value. And you attach a lease purchase and sale exhibit that covers everybody's butt, and then the actual lease for lease purchase itself. So what we're going to go over first is the lease purchase and sale exhibit. This is a one-page exhibit, okay, that says that this purchase is subject to a lease first. And a lot of this verbiage is pulled from the purchase and sale agreement. A lot of it is repeated in the lease, but we'll go through it. Lease purchase. Prior to purchasing the property, the buyer, currently referred to as the tenant, will be leasing the property in accordance with the terms and conditions of a separate lease agreement. We'll go over that shortly. Between the parties attached hereto as an exhibit. In the event the lease is terminated by the seller due to default of the tenant, buyer shall also be deemed to be in default, and seller may pursue all of its remedies available at law or in equity regarding said default. So if the tenant/buyer defaults, the tenant/buyer could lose their security deposit, could lose earnest money, could lose any additional money that they've paid in addition to the lease to be saved for them for later on, okay? Those are the seller's typical remedies. Lease terminating due diligence. So when you are doing a lease purchase, there's due diligence up front. And this is the hard thing for tenants to understand. They think they can just move into the house and then the landlord's going to fix everything while they're there. Well, they have due diligence up front because if there are any major mechanical issues, if there's any mold, if there's anything going on with the house that is expensive to fix, it needs to be fixed just like in a purchase and sale agreement, because once they move in, that's it. They don't get a new roof before closing because it started to leak, because now that roof is their responsibility. So this says, as of the binding agreement date, buyer is residing in the property or is not residing in the property. They may or may not already be there. If the buyer is not residing in the property, the lease shall not commence and the buyer will not be granted possession until due diligence has expired. Okay, so they do due diligence before they move in. Just like when you're buying a house, you do due diligence up front. The parties mutually agree to proceed toward closing. Oh, hold on, where am I? Until due diligence is expired and the parties mutually agree to proceed toward closing, sorry. If buyer is residing in the property and buyer elects to terminate the purchase and sale during due diligence, then the lease shall, at the sole discretion of the seller/landlord, terminate immediately upon notice from seller to buyer, giving 10 days thereafter, which date shall be deemed waived. So, I know this is rough. If they're not in the property, they need to do their due diligence up front. If the seller doesn't agree to do what they want, they can terminate, just like in a regular purchase, and then no lease exists. If they're already in the property leasing it, and they want to do some sort of lease purchase, and you have to use this exhibit, they need to do due diligence anyway. And if during due diligence, there's something wrong with the property that the seller won't fix, they need to move. Okay? Because the seller's not going to fix it. And if they want to do, they need to go find another lease purchase property. If lease is not terminated per this paragraph, it will remain effect and parties will continue in their roles as landlord and tenant. So they can stay, they can leave. They're just not going to purchase the property. But they need to pay attention to due diligence because, again, one of my team members did a lease purchase for somebody and they didn't do a home inspection during due diligence and later said, oh, well, we're not going to pay the security deposit because this is wrong. Oh, the landlord fixed it. And, oh, well, we're not going to pay the rent now because we found this to be wrong. And they ended up living there like 4 months. They didn't pay a dime. They were serial lease purchase people, and this is what they did. And they literally would move every 3 or 4 months and put a landlord through this. So anyway, make sure that due diligence happens up front if they are not in the property. Sold as is, landlord's duty to repair. All parties understand that if buyer has not terminated this agreement during due diligence, the property is sold as is. Duh, we know that, but they need to know that. The buyer tenant agrees to make every effort to maintain property in the same condition as of the date of binding agreement between the binding agreement date and the closing date, and shall only be obligated to those repairs as required by this statute. All right. Well, this is in the lease for lease purchase, and we'll go over that in a few minutes. Rental credit, here it is. Subject to the approval of the buyer's or the tenant's mortgage lender. Now, the lender needs to approve this. Seller agrees that the market rent for the property will be X. Buyer/tenant agrees to pay Y. Seller or landlord agrees or does not agree to apply the difference between the market rent and the contract rent toward the purchase of the property. Okay? So they're paying $1,000 a month in rent. They agree to pay $1,200 a month. The lender approves that the extra $200 will go toward or be credited to them at closing, down payment, closing costs, whatever, but it's not necessarily money that the landlord needs to bring to closing, but it's documented money that will go to be a credit to them at closing, okay? Should the purchase and sale of the property fail to close for any reason, other than seller's default, there will be no refund. Okay? So if you can get a tenant into a lease purchase who's willing to put more money on the line, they're probably serious. If they're not, they are probably not ever going to close it. Keep in touch with them, certainly, but you know, they don't have any skin in the game. Okay? All cash sale, buyer/tenant understands that regardless of any amount seller has agreed to pay toward their closing costs, this agreement is not contingent on the buyer qualifying for any type of loan to purchase property. The agreement is an all-cash transaction with the purchase price to be paid no later than at the closing. So no finance contingency. They don't get a finance contingency. They don't get an appraisal contingency. So you have to make sure that if something happens with their financing, and that typically it does, and that's why this is here. Typically, they don't get approved for the loan or something else happens, they don't get their money back. So they need to be serious about this and they need to understand what they're doing, again, if you are on the buyer tenant side. Option to extend closing. There can be no option, or they can agree to extend the option with more money. Okay? And they can agree to a number of days to extend it. And the option money can be non-refundable. Okay. There should always be money involved in any extension of any contract, even if it's a standard purchase and sale, particularly if you're on the seller side. But anytime you extend anything, somebody needs to have some skin in the game and there needs to be money involved, okay? That's it. That's the one-page exhibit that goes with the lease purchase agreement. Barbara, do you have a question, or does anyone else have a question?
I do have a question. So let me just go back and make sure I understand this. You said, I think you said that the tenant slash buyer has to be approved up front for this with their lender, correct?
The thing they have to be approved for is the rental credit.
Okay.
Their lender has to agree to allowing the seller to escrow this money and bring it to the closing table at closing as a credit to them. That's what the lender has to agree to.
Okay, so since they're agreeing to that, do they go through, you might have said it, but I'm trying to still remember. They have to go through a pre-approval for this up front?
No, they're not going to get pre-approved. Their credit's trash. That's why they're doing a lease purchase.
Well, then why are, I mean, if the lender has to agree for the rental credit, then we're saying that they would be going with this lender when they get ready to do the loan at
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. They're committing to a lender prior to being approved. Another lender might approve of that credit down the road, but another lender might not.
Yeah.
And that's why this is again, this is a warning, you know, hold harmless. Your lender needs to agree to allow the seller to hold this money in escrow for you. And if he doesn't, you don't get it.
Okay.
And most lenders do, but again, there are parameters around how that money is held and how that money is accounted for. That's the biggest thing. Your tenant needs to make a copy of their check every month before they send it to the landlord, or they need to keep track of the web bill pay transactions and the cashed web bill pay checks. They don't need to be doing PayPal. They don't need to be doing any kind of Cash App. They don't need to be doing something that can't be tracked. The lender is going to want, number one, those rent payments tracked to make sure that they're on time. And number two, to make sure that the extra amount that's specified in here is included so they get the proper credit at closing. If you've ever been a landlord and your tenant is trying to buy a home, a lot of times you're asked to provide to their lender 12 months proof of on-time rental payments. So when you're a landlord, you want to keep track of when you receive. I keep all the checks, or, you know, if they do a web bill pay or some sort of direct deposit into our account, that's electronically saved, so I can pull that out as proof later on if it's ever needed by them to purchase a home. So is everybody on board? Okay.
Yeah, I just don't see from a buyer's renter's perspective. I mean, I don't really see the
advantage.
Exactly.
There isn't one.
That I guess if they love this house, then this might be a way to kind of quote unquote lock the house up. But then if you really saved your money and put that money in an account, saved it up, at some point you would be able to hopefully get your credit built up and then purchase the house anyway.
Correct.
Okay.
Again, you know, we say buyers are liars, sellers lie too.
Mm-hmm.
Tenants lie like nobody's business.
I've had them. Oh my goodness, yeah.
Oh yeah, they're like, yeah. Oh yeah, I did get evicted 3 years ago. I forgot. No, you didn't.
No, you didn't forget.
you know, oh yeah, I was kiting checks in Florida 2 years ago. You know, it shows up. I've, it's all shown up in these background checks I've done on
Yeah.
tenants. So again, you know, these people they're typically, their credit is so bad they can't get into an apartment. They're afraid a landlord won't rent to them because their credit's so bad. So they're going to lie and say, "Oh yeah, we're working on our credit, and we're going to buy the house in 2 years." Now those people won't pay extra. They almost never pay extra. Okay, but those people definitely won't pay extra to have that money escrowed. And all you can do is keep your fingers crossed that they don't screw things up. So I'm working with an agent now. She's been trying for 6 months. This tenant was supposed to buy this property 6 months ago, and they've been getting extension after extension after extension. And now the agent's mad because the seller won't give them another extension. Well, hell, you know, she's given them 6 months worth of extensions on a month-to-month basis so far. She's ready to cut bait. I would be too. But the agent doesn't understand. She's like, she's being a bitch. Okay.
My property,
You
I
know,
want to sell out.
right. So the lease for lease purchase is not much different from a regular lease, but it is a lease specific to lease purchase. So I'm going to point out a few of the differences. The biggest difference, you know, on page 1, you've got the property address, lease start date, how much the rent is, when the rent is due, late charges, security deposit. And then you've got section 5, lease for lease purchase. Okay. This lease is an exhibit to a lease purchase agreement between buyer and seller with an offer date of, a copy of which is incorporated hereto by reference. This lease is intended to be a separate lease under the transaction covering the time period prior to closing. All right. Rekey fee is the same. Non-refundable administrative fee is the same. Pets, smoking, subletting, utilities, holdover, fee to prepare a lease amendment, and use. This is all in the regular lease. Appliances, who does lawn maintenance, who does pest control, has the property ever flooded, lead-based paint, liquidated damages in case the tenant/buyer stops paying their rent and the landlord has to file for eviction and the tenant wants it rescinded. Unauthorized pet charge, unauthorized smoking charge, brokerage relationships, material relationship disclosure, if any.
Wait,
The owner is,
Eileen, I'm sorry. Can you go
that's
back
okay.
to that? Can you go back to that liquidated damages paid by tenant? You said something about
Liquidated damages.
damages, yeah. You
Fee to
said
halt
something about
dispossessory.
in case the tenant wanted, just go through that again, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Fee to halt dispossessory action. Dispossessory action is eviction.
Yeah.
So when a landlord goes to the courthouse to file for eviction, there are fees that they have to pay to get on the docket in the court. So if the landlord does file with the court, the tenant gets notification of that, goes, oh crap, he's serious. They decide to catch up on the rent. The lease can also charge them a fee to halt.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. So that fee can be anywhere from $100. I think it costs $75 to file for dispossessory. I generally put in here somewhere around $250. You know, other agents that have a tenant, and this is in a typical lease, they push back. They're like, why so much? I said, pay the rent. Don't worry about how much it is. Pay the rent. Plus an administrative fee. Now, sometimes a landlord has to use an attorney. That's where that administrative fee comes in. All right. So if the attorney has charged them $250 to prepare docs, there might be another fee in here. Okay. So that's
Gotcha.
what dispossessory is. Denial of access charge. This is important too, because if the tenant is complaining that, you know, the air conditioning's broke and the landlord sets an appointment for them to come in, that HVAC company's charging a $100 trip fee. Up, the tenant's not there, the landlord still has to pay the $100 trip fee. So it's important to put a fee in here. Usually I put about $100 to $150. Unauthorized pet charge. Tenants get pets all the time and don't tell landlords. So there needs to be an unauthorized pet charge. I usually put about 1 month's worth of rent for an unauthorized pet. It's pretty steep. Don't do it. Unauthorized smoking, same thing. Put about 1 month's rent. You know, if I say no smoking and you're smoking, I got to repaint the house. Utility disconnection charge. I've started using this one. I didn't use it early on as a landlord, but early on had a tenant that decided that she wasn't going to use the heat and air and lived in the property, I think 2 or 3 years without using the heat and air. And we had to replace the system when she left because it'd been sitting for that long and it wouldn't fire up. So she never turned on the gas. Now you've got other tenants that, and I had this happen to a friend, the tenant wasn't paying the rent and filed for bankruptcy. When a tenant files for bankruptcy, the landlord has no recourse. They can't go on the property, they can't file eviction, they can't do anything until the bankruptcy is either discharged or whatever. So he couldn't go anywhere near the property. And by the time we got it through the court system to have her evicted, she had left months prior and had turned off all the utilities. Oh my God, the stench and the bugs. And it was, so if he'd have known that the utilities had been turned off, he could have turned them on to keep some of that from happening. But you know, you can also get what's called a landlord utility connection, that the minute the tenant disconnects the utility, it goes into your name and you get notice that they've disconnected it. So there's fees that can be associated with that, thank goodness. Okay. So we went over brokerage. Material relationship is the same if they are a relative or business business relationship, any of those. Disclosure of who the owner is and who the management company is if it's not the owner, and who the tenant's going to contact. This is again all in a typical lease, who the tenant's going to contact if they need to have repairs made. Now, again, all of these paragraphs are follow-up for the first 2 pages and gives a little bit of detail in legal verbiage as to what everything on the first page means. So, talks about notice, holding over, fee to prepare lease, appliances, liquidated damages, agency and brokerage. There's a lot here. Early termination. Section C, other terms and conditions. Now this is where it gets slightly different. Tenant's responsibilities. Okay. This is where it has changed, that the tenant is now not responsible for all repairs. The tenant is responsible for basically the same set of repairs that they would be responsible for if they were a tenant. So if you look at this section and then you look at the lease, the regular lease, the verbiage is pretty much the same. I know it's hard for you to compare these side by side, especially since I've got them blown up in a different size. Let's make that a little bigger. But now the verbiage is the same. It basically says that the tenant has gone through the property and all major defects, all defects that will create an unsafe living condition are being repaired or have been repaired. Tenant has to change light bulbs. Oh my God, don't talk to me about tenants and light bulbs. Change the HVAC filter. If they clog a pipe, they have to fix it. If it's the septic tank or anything outside the house, the landlord has to fix it, on and on and on. So it's the same verbiage that is in the standard lease that is now in the lease purchase. That used to be different. Now, the verbiage here, oops, sorry, wrong document. The verbiage about smoke detectors, freezing pipes, mold and mildew, access codes, that's all the same, okay? So nothing has changed in that respect. Again, this used to be much different, but thank goodness it's now the same, and they are tenants, and if anything major, if the roof starts to leak, the landlord does have to fix it. Rules and regulations are the same. No water beds, all of those things. Personal property loss is the same. They're a tenant. They need to have they need to have rental insurance over their personal belongings. Disclaimers, everything else in this agreement is the same now. The biggest difference is that section on page 1. Whoops, let me go back down. That references the lease for lease purchase in section 5. That's the biggest difference between the two documents. You can look at them side by side. They're formatted slightly differently, but they're almost identically the same. So again, there is no more rent to own. It's all lease for lease purchase. They can decide to do it up front. They can decide to do it later on. During the downturn 10 years ago, what I saw more often than not was if a landlord had over improved a property or had had to spend more money renovating a property than they anticipated, they would put it literally out there for lease purchase because they could not recoup their expenses or what they put into the property in the current market. So they would overprice the property, hoping against all hope that the tenant that they got in there that wanted to do a lease purchase would actually buy it in 2 or 3 years, and the market would have improved to the point where they can recoup their costs. In the meantime, they're collecting rent. More often than not, tenants let repairs go, and the landlords ended up rehabbing the property a second time. But with the current set of contracts, they're still tenants. The smartest thing for them to do and for the landlords to let them do is just be tenants. And at the end of 2 years, if they have saved the money and they want to buy the property, bring you in to do a purchase and sale agreement. But again, there are some people that feel like this is the way they should go. So does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, how does the agent get paid on this?
And that's the thing. That's another thing. You should get paid per the lease. Whatever the lease listing says, the amount that you would get paid for putting a tenant in the property. There is an amount, and you would do a regular commission agreement.
Okay.
That would pay you a 3% commission if the sale ever closes.
Okay.
But in the meantime, you're just kind of hanging out waiting. So yeah, you would get paid twice, and you put the tenant in place when the sale closes. So again, why do all this paperwork up front when it's really not necessary? Has anybody ever had to do one of these? I know some of you have been around longer than others. Jeff, do you have any experience with this? I think we
No, I
lost
do
you.
not. Nope.
Okay. I didn't know if you'd had a chance. You've been around a little bit longer than most. How about Wayne? Wayne's come back into real estate after having been gone a while. Wayne, have you done any lease purchase contracts in your day?
Yeah, I'm trying to think, Eileen.
Yeah, I think like what you said, I think I've been approached by people that want to do it, but once you kind of get into it, they really just couldn't qualify, and it just didn't make sense. So, no, I don't think I
Yeah. And that's what happens more often than not. You'll get that phone call and they'll say, I can't buy right now, but I don't want to move again. I want to do a lease purchase. And that's where you run into, you have to explain, because again, these people, they honestly think in a lot of cases that they're going to pay $1,000 a month in rent, and they're going to get that $1,000 a month credited back to them at closing, and that's not how it works. The landlord has expenses. The landlord's doing repairs. You are not going to get all that money back. You don't get a free house. And they don't look at it that way for some reason. It's just like right now, people have lost their jobs. A lot of them are making more in unemployment than they made in their jobs. Okay. But they're using that as an excuse to not pay their rent. Well, our landlord still has expenses. The landlord still has to pay taxes. The landlord still has to pay for insurance. The landlord still has to do repairs. If you're not paying your rent and the landlord therefore can't pay the mortgage, you might end up losing where you're living. You know, you're expecting certain things from your landlord. Don't expect him to come in and fix a leaking faucet if you're not paying your rent. Now, there are other things that create hazardous conditions that have to be taken care of, but don't expect a lot of cooperation either. Got a question from Naruna. Is lease purchase the same as lease option? Yes, there is only one option these days. So lease purchase is it. Leasing with an option to purchase, you can do, it's the same paperwork, and that was the first document that we went over, was the, you know, oh no, I didn't go over the option document. Thank you, sorry. Hold on, let me go back to screen share. I did forget that document. Okay, so there's the option contract. Okay, lease with an option agreement to purchase lease property. And this is similar to the lease purchase. It is still another document. Why would you do this up front if at the end of 2 years the landlord still wants to sell and you still want to buy? Just enter into a purchase and sale agreement. But this requires payment of what's called an option. Okay, so you get a grant option. You put down a certain amount of money paid by tenant to landlord as an option payment. Landlord does hereby grant to tenant the option to purchase the property on the terms and conditions set forth in this agreement. While landlord hereby grants tenant the right to purchase the property, tenant shall have no obligation to purchase the property unless they notify the landlord they can do so and exercise their option. Option payment, this is the kicker. The option payment shall become part of the property of the landlord, shall not be refundable, shall not be refundable in the event the tenant does not exercise their option, shall not be applied toward the purchase price, shall not be credited or offset against any other sum owing to the tenant or the landlord, like a security deposit or rent. Okay, so this is free money to the landlord. Exercise of option. I'm going to blow this up a little bit bigger. Tenant shall have the right to exercise their option to purchase the property if they are not under default at the time and the option is exercised in accordance with the terms of this agreement no more than X number of days prior to the lease expiring, typically 60 days. If the option is not timely exercised, it shall lapse and not be further legally enforceable or in effect. Notice of tenant's decision to exercise the option to purchase shall be given by tenant to landlord in accordance with this. But again, they don't have any obligation to. The date upon which the landlord receives such notice shall be referred to as the exercise option date. Okay, issues pertaining to the purchase and sale. We're talking about how much he's going to buy it for. We're going to talk about the legal description. Because again, this is an exhibit to a lease, not a purchase and sale agreement. Earnest money and its delivery. Cost of settlement and other expenses. Seller can agree to pay closing costs. Closing date within next number of days of exercise of the option. There's no specific date because we don't know when they can exercise their option anytime between the time this is executed and it expires. There is no specific date for exercising the option. They still have the right to extend their closing date, the unilateral right. Whoops. Closing attorney goes here. And this is how we used to fill out purchase and sale agreements. It was a little bit on every page. Talks about title, risk of damage to property sold as is, earnest money return. This is all standard verbiage from the purchase and sale agreement. Agency and brokerage, material relationship, lead-based paint, delivery of notices, default, other provisions. Conflicts. This agreement shall control over any conflicting or inconsistent provision in the lease. Effect of closing date on lease term. This basically says once this has been exercised and the transaction's closed, the lease expires immediately. Okay, would make sense. They bought the house. Cyber fraud, limit on broker's liability, exhibits, other exhibits. But this in itself is an exhibit to a lease. As the purchase agreement, you can also include an association disclosure, a seller's disclosure, legal description, and you can add a loan contingency. See, this allows for a loan contingency, whereas the other does not. So, and then you've got steps and a signature page, just like in every other agreement.
And so we went through the earnest money. Earnest money is handled the same way it would be in a typical sale.
Well, earnest money would be deliverable at a different time. Okay.
Yeah, we didn't talk. So
earnest money, you put an amount. It's going to be paid to a holder, an attorney, a broker. It's going to be delivered by check, cash, or wire. The earnest money has been delivered. Probably not. Buyer agrees to pay earnest money within X number of days of exercising their option, or within X number of days from the date the seller provides buyer with written evidence from seller's lender and lien holders that the short, oh, why does it say short sale? That's weird. Forget C, A or B.
Okay.
So it's not always delivered up front.
Okay.
So, and this is something that you add to a lease. It's typically added later. It's typically added, you know, once the tenant's been in the property about 18 months and they talk to the seller and they say, I think I want to buy it. The seller's like, well, now I want to put it on the market. Well, it's kind of like in the purchase and sale agreement, and we'll go back up here real quick. In the purchase and sale agreement, you have an option payment for due diligence. Remember, we've talked about this option payment for due diligence. A real dirty thing to call it is a bribe. Is you pay money to the seller to give you a due diligence period, but it's not refundable. This is the same thing. This option for option payment to buy the property is the same thing. It's a bribe. Don't put the property on the market. I'm going to give you some free money. You get to keep this no matter what happens. And I'm going to try to buy the house before the lease is up. Barbara, you look confused.
No, I'm not confused. I'm just still wondering why anybody would want to
Why
do
somebody
that.
would do
Because,
this?
yeah, because you don't know what. I mean, you say you want to buy the house, you give them this money to hold the house, but you don't know what the house, I mean, maybe you have an idea of what the house is worth, but you won't really know that until you get to that period of time when you're ready to exercise the option. And at that point, it could be less or more. I mean, I'm
Well,
just,
see,
I'm
with
just
it,
thinking from both sides. What are the advantages? I mean, I can sort of see it, but not really. I'd rather just save the money and then get what I want. I don't know.
the advantage is to the seller. It's not an advantage to the buyer. It's all the advantage to the seller.
Yeah, I guess because they get the chunk of money and then they have a ready
Willing and able.
willing buyer, but they're not able yet, and hopefully they'll be able at some point in the future. Okay.
And again, typically this is not, the option agreement is not entered into at the time of the lease. What's entered into at the time of the lease is the lease for lease purchase and the lease purchase agreement. An option is something that comes along typically later on. You know, again, we've talked about this in the purchase and sale agreement, this option payment for due diligence. If you're in a multiple offer situation and you want to make your contract look better than every other buyer that's out there, instead of asking for a get out of jail free card for 14 days, you give them some money to give you those 14 days to do your due diligence. Everybody else wants 14 days for free. Your buyer's going to pay them $500 to have 14 days. Who would not accept the free $500?
Yeah, I mean, I get that from the due diligence period, but I mean, just looking at the option piece from.
Same thing on the option. It's
Yeah,
the exact same thing. The buyer or the tenant is paying the landlord money not to put the property on the market.
Until they can buy it, they have a chance to buy it.
Right. And then they don't have to put up with people coming in and out while they're in the property, all of that. And they may truly want to buy the property.
Okay.
These are people who truly want to purchase this property.
But the money that they've spent is pretty much lost unless,
Option payments are not
Right.
refundable.
right.
Not in either situation. Not refundable.
Mm.
So any questions? Okay.